The smell hit Nora Callahan before she even pushed the gate open. Decades of mud and animal waste baked into concrete, absorbed into wood rot and corrugated tin that had been peeling since before she was born. The kind of smell that doesn't wash out of a place, just settles deeper over time until it becomes part of the structure itself, part of the air, part of whatever history those walls decided to keep. She stood at the entrance of the pig pen with a legal document in her left hand and a gas station coffee in her right, and she read the description one more time the way you reread a word that stops making sense the longer you stare at it. Parcel C, approximately 0.4 acres, existing agricultural outbuilding, pig pen structure, concrete foundation, corrugated metal roofing, non-operational. No assessed value. Conveyed to Nora Jean Callahan in full and final settlement of her interest in the estate of Gerald Patrick Callahan, deceased. Non-operational. That was the word that stayed with her. Non-operational, like the building had once done something useful and now just existed as an insult that someone had filed in triplicate. Like the county assessor had looked at it and felt embarrassed on its behalf and decided the kindest thing to do was assign it no worth at all. She had driven 4 hours from Lexington in her 2009 Civic with the passenger window that wouldn't close all the way and the check engine light that had been on so long she'd stopped registering it. She'd left at 5 in the morning so she could be back before her daughter Lily's school bus came at 3:30 because there was nobody else to meet that bus. There had never been anybody else, not for the last 6 years, and Nora had built her entire life around that fact the way you build a house around a load-bearing wall, carefully, with everything arranged so it doesn't fall. The pig pen sat on a 1/4 acre of the far back end of what had been her father's 200-acre farm in Harlan County, Kentucky. The rest of the farm, the farmhouse built in 1938, the working barn, the equipment shed, the pond acreage, the timber section, the grazing fields, had been divided between her 2 older brothers, Dennis and Paul, and her sister Karen, in a will that Gerald Callahan had apparently updated 14 months before his death without mentioning it to anyone, or at least not to Nora. She'd learned about the update the same way she'd learned about most things in her family's recent history, last and wrong. Her brother Dennis had called her on a Tuesday evening in October while she was supervising Lily's homework and eating crackers over the kitchen sink because there wasn't time for an actual dinner before the second job started. He'd said Dad was gone, heart attack, quick, the way he always said things, flat and efficient, as if information were a resource he'd rather not spend on her. The funeral was Saturday. Could she get there? She'd said yes, because you say yes to your father's funeral, you find a way, even when yes means 3 days of no income and a neighbor who agrees to watch Lily as a favor you'll spend the next year repaying. The will reading happened in the office of a probate attorney in Cumberland named Arthur Fitch, a small man in his 60s with bifocals and a manner that suggested he'd delivered bad news so many times he'd stopped noticing when it landed. Nora sat in a chair against the wall. Dennis and Paul sat up front where the family sat. Karen was beside them. Nora was beside the door, which maybe said something, or maybe was just how the chairs had fallen. Arthur Fitch read for 11 minutes. The farmhouse and the north 40 acres to Dennis, who was the eldest and had, according to the will, demonstrated consistent commitment to the maintenance of the family property. The south 80 acres and equipment to Paul, who had helped with harvests and repairs over many years. The timber section and the pond acreage, 22 acres total, to Karen, whose emotional support during the final years had been, per Gerald's language, invaluable. The savings account, approximately $41,000, split between Dennis, Paul, and Karen equally. The personal property, the furniture, the tools, the antiques, the collection of vintage seed catalogs Gerald had kept in the study since 1975, distributed among the 3 of them. And then Parcel C. Arthur Fitch read it without inflection. He did not look up when he finished. He moved immediately to closing language about probate timelines and filing requirements, as if the thing he'd just said was administrative rather than staggering. Nora didn't ask any questions in the meeting. She wasn't sure her voice would have worked if she'd tried. She sat with the gas station coffee she'd brought in from the parking lot and read the words on the page in front of her. No assessed value, conveyed in full and final settlement, and understood what her father had decided she was worth. Dennis asked if she wanted to stay for dinner after, in the way you ask someone something when you're hoping they'll say no. Karen patted her shoulder in the parking lot. and said these things were always complicated, and she was sure Dad had had his reasons. Paul didn't say anything at all, which had always been his particular style of cruelty. Not active enough to feel like attack, just absent enough to feel like erasure. She drove home through the mountains in the dark and did not cry until she was past Corbin. And even then she kept it short because there was nothing productive in it, and she had learned, over 6 years of being the only person in her household who could solve problems, to be economical with feelings that didn't help. That had been 4 months ago. The thing about Nora Callahan that the people who dismissed her tended to miscalculate was that she was not actually fragile. She had been shaped to look that way, small, quiet, tending toward practical clothes and no unnecessary noise. But fragility was not the operating principle. What she ran on was something colder and more durable. She ran on the understanding that nobody was coming, that she had known this for a long time, and that knowing it was not defeat but information. She had been 31 when Marcus left. Lily was 14 months old, crawling but not walking, doing the thing babies do where they pull up on furniture and then sit down hard and look at you for confirmation that the world is trustworthy. Nora had been doing shift work at a distribution center outside Lexington, nights mostly, and Marcus had been finishing a degree he'd been finishing for 4 years, and when he explained that he was leaving he'd made it sound like a reasonable decision that 2 sensible adults could process together. He had not been unkind about it. He had just been gone by the end of the week, forwarding address in Cincinnati, and the apartment had contracted around Nora and Lily like a fist. That had been the architecture of the years since. 2 jobs for most of it, 1 steady and 1 rotating. The distribution center in the early years, then a dental office as a receptionist, which paid less, but felt less like walking through sand. A second job at a grocery store bakery, early morning shifts, 5 to 9 before Lily woke up, which required an alarm at 4:15 and a level of physical determination that Nora had stopped thinking of as impressive and started thinking of as structural. You maintained the structure or the structure fell. That was all. Lily was 6 now and in 1st grade, and had her father's mouth and Nora's eyes and a personality that had emerged from the combination like something neither of them would have predicted. Serious, funny in a dry way that caught adults off guard, deeply interested in insects and weather patterns. She collected facts about tornadoes the way other children collected trading cards, reciting them at the dinner table with the satisfaction of someone who has organized the world into comprehensible categories. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex north of Lexington where the hot water pressure had been unreliable since 2021 and the parking lot flooded in heavy rain. The rent was $840 a month, which was below market rate because the landlord, a man named Terrence, had not raised it in 3 years out of some combination of inertia and basic decency that Nora was careful never to count on continuing. She kept a spreadsheet on her phone of every monthly expense, color-coded, updated every Sunday evening after Lily was asleep. Green meant covered. Yellow meant covered if nothing went wrong. Red meant she was moving money around again, borrowing from the next week to pay for this one, which was a system that worked until it didn't. The dental office had cut her hours in January. Not fired, just reduced, the kind of reduction that sounds temporary when management explains it and feels permanent by March. She was down from 32 hours to 22, which was the difference between manageable and not manageable expressed as 10 hours. She'd picked up extra bakery shifts. She'd sold some things. She'd done the math 12 different ways, and the math kept coming out the same, which was that they were 2 or 3 months of ordinary bad luck away from something she didn't have language for yet. When the letter came from Arthur Fitch's office confirming the deed transfer for Parcel C, she'd almost thrown it out. She had stood at the mailboxes in the apartment lobby and held it for a moment and thought about what a waste of paper it was. The state of Kentucky formally documenting that she owned something nobody wanted, and then something in her that was not hope exactly. More like stubbornness wearing hope's coat, made her open it instead. She read it in the elevator. She read it again in the hallway. She sat down at the kitchen table with Lily asleep in the next room, and she put the document flat on the table, and she looked at it for a long time. What she owned was a concrete floor and a tin roof and a smell that didn't come out. She owned a gate that hung crooked on its hinges and a trough that had cracked down the middle sometime in the 1990s and a drainage channel along the west wall that had probably been functional once and now was home to whatever lived in drainage channels when nobody was maintaining them. She owned 0. for acres. And she sat with that for a long time, because the alternative was going to bed and waking up and going back to work and continuing to wait for the math to work out. And that had a shape she recognized, and the shape was not good. She pulled up Google on her laptop. She typed how much is land in Harlan County, Kentucky per acre. She typed, can you sell agricultural outbuildings separate from land? She typed pig pen conversion ideas, and then felt briefly ridiculous, and then stopped caring that she felt ridiculous and kept reading. She did not sleep that night until past 2. The first person she called was her friend Deb, who had known her since the distribution center days and who had the specific gift of being honest without being brutal about it. Nora, honey, they gave you a pig pen. I know. Your dad left you a literal pig pen, and your brothers got 200 acres of Kentucky farmland. I know that too. And you want to what? Move into the pig pen? I want to see what I actually have before I decide what I have. There's a difference. There was a pause on Deb's end that meant she was choosing between several things she could say. She chose, okay, what do you know about it? Nora had spent 2 weeks building a file. She'd pulled county records, tax assessments going back to 1962, old aerial photographs from a university archive that digitized agricultural survey images from the 1950s through the 1980s. She'd found a reference in the County Historical Society newsletter from 1987 to the Callahan farm and its unusual construction methods, a phrase that had stopped her and that she'd read 3 times. She knew that her grandfather, Emmett Callahan, had built the pig pen in 1951. Not had it built it. She'd found a building permit in county records, Emmett Callahan listed as general contractor, a detail that was unusual because Emmett Callahan had been a tobacco farmer with a 7th grade education, not a contractor. The materials listed on the permit were more unusual still. Reinforced concrete foundation, poured to a depth of 36 inches. For a pig pen, in 1951, you pour a foundation 36 inches deep for one of 2 reasons. Either you're building something that needs to carry significant structural load, or you're building something that needs to cover significant structural load. Deb was quiet for longer this time. Your grandfather was a tobacco farmer. Yes. Who built a pig pen with a foundation that deep. That's what the records say. And nobody thought that was strange. The pigs didn't complain, I guess. Another pause. Then, when are you going? She went on a Thursday in February, which was the only day she could arrange 4 hours of coverage for Lily without it costing her more than the drive was worth. The morning was gray and cold the way Kentucky mountains get in February. Not dramatic, just heavy, like the sky couldn't decide whether to do something or not, and had settled on pressing down. The pig pen was at the very back of what had been the farm, separated from the main property by a rusted wire fence and a stand of cedars that had been growing unchecked for at least 20 years. You reached it by a track off the county road that wasn't on any map she'd found, just a flattening in the vegetation where vehicles had once gone regularly and then stopped going. She parked on the road and walked. The gate was padlocked, her padlock now, or rather her lock, because Fitch's office had sent a key along with the deed, a small brass key on a ring with a tag that said Parcel C in the attorney's handwriting. She'd held that key 100 times in the past 4 months, carried it in her jacket pocket, taken it out at the bakery at 5 in the morning, and turned it over in her flour-white hands while the ovens preheated. The lock opened on the first try. The smell came when the gate swung inward. She stood in the entrance for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the dimmer light inside the structure. The tin roof let in gaps of gray winter brightness at irregular intervals where panels had separated or corroded through. The concrete floor was dark with old organic matter and the specific patina of a surface that had been wet and dried and wet again for 70 years. The trough along the east wall was cracked in 2 places. The drainage channel ran along the west wall to a grate in the far corner. It was approximately 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. Unremarkable, ugly, smelling of time and neglect and the particular sadness of agricultural structures that had outlasted their purpose. She walked the perimeter first, the way she'd read you should when evaluating a structure, edge to edge, looking at the walls where they met the floor, looking at the floor where it met itself, looking for anything the ordinary I might miss. The ordinary I would have missed it. She almost missed it herself, and she'd been looking specifically. It was in the northeast corner, behind where the trough's broken section leaned against the wall at an angle that had probably seemed stable to whoever last walked out of this building. You had to move the broken trough piece. Heavy, concrete, awkward, to see the floor beneath it. And even when you saw it, you had to know what you were looking for, because what you were seeing was a rectangle in the concrete, approximately 4 feet by 3 feet, outlined by a seam so fine that decades of accumulation had filled it until it was barely a shadow. But it was a seam. A deliberate, geometric, cut seam in a poured concrete floor. And in the center of the rectangle, set flush with the surface, was a steel ring handle, folded flat, the same color as the concrete because someone had painted it to match, or because it had oxidized to that shade over 70 years. Either way, it was almost invisible. Almost. Nora crouched down in the cold, in the smell, and put her finger into the ring and felt it move. She did not pull it. Not yet. She crouched there with her finger through the ring and breathed deliberately for a moment. The way she'd learned to breathe when things happened that required her to stay level, the way she'd breathed when the pediatrician used a word that turned out not to mean what she feared, the way she'd breathed on the phone with the landlord last spring, the way she'd breathed in Arthur Fitch's office when she heard what her father had decided. She let the moment have its shape. Then she pulled. The hatch was heavier than it looked. She got it up on the second try, bracing her feet against the surrounding concrete for leverage, and it came with a sound that seemed enormous in the enclosed space. A dull, pressurized thud as a seal broke that had apparently been holding for some time, followed by a rush of air that moved past her face and smelled of nothing. Clean, temperature-controlled nothing. She sat on her heels at the edge and looked down. Concrete steps. 6 of them, wide and even, dropping into darkness. The walls of the passage were poured concrete, smooth, gray, without seam or crack. At the bottom of the steps, a steel door, painted dark green, with a single lever handle and no visible lock. She checked her phone. 2 bars of signal, which was about what she'd expected this far out. She called Deb. Deb picked up on the second ring. How bad is the smell? I found something. A pause. Found something like an old pig trough, or found something like a staircase under the floor. The silence on Deb's end lasted long enough that Nora checked the screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Nora, I'm not going down without telling someone. You are absolutely not going down. You are going to call. I'm telling you first. If I'm not back in contact in 30 minutes, call sheriff's office in Harlan County. I'm at the Callahan farm, East End, the old pig pen. You have that. I have it. Nora, please. 30 minutes. She put the phone in her jacket pocket and looked at the steps again. 36 inches of reinforced concrete foundation, built in 1951 by a tobacco farmer who had no business building anything to those specifications. Unusual construction methods. A hatch painted to disappear, a seal that had held for decades, an air coming out of the ground that smelled like a place that had been maintained rather than abandoned. She went down. The steps were solid. No flex, no give, no sound under her weight. She kept one hand on the wall going down, and the concrete was cool and dry and slightly rough in a way that suggested it had been given a finishing coat, not left raw. At the bottom, she stood before the green steel door and put her hand on the lever and felt that it was not locked. The door opened away from her, into the space beyond, and what hit her first was temperature. It was warmer down here than it had been upstairs, warmer than February outside, a steady, regulated warmth, like a room with a working thermostat. And then what hit her second was light, because as the door swung open, a series of low-wattage fixtures flickered on in sequence along the ceiling, triggered by her presence, and illuminated a room that had no business existing under a pig pen in Harlan County, Kentucky. It was large. She estimated 30 feet across and 40 feet deep, though she would find out later she was underestimating in both dimensions. The ceiling was perhaps 9 feet high, poured concrete with flush lighting fixtures in 2 parallel rows. The walls were concrete block, smooth finished, painted a cream color that had gone slightly yellow with age but had not cracked or peeled. The floor was concrete sealed with something that had kept it clean and even. Along the left wall, shelving units, steel-framed, military-grade, holding stacked wooden crates of various sizes, each labeled in handwriting she recognized immediately as her grandfather Emmett's, the same careful, slightly leftward slant she'd seen in the family Bible, in the margins of the almanacs that had been in her father's study, in the birthday cards that had come from Emmett until his death in 1979 when Nora was not yet born, but which she'd read in a box her mother saved. Along the right wall, a workbench, long, solid oak, with tools hanging above it on a pegboard. Some she recognized standard woodworking and repair implements. Others she didn't, smaller precision tools that looked purpose-built for something specific she couldn't name. At the far end of the room, two additional steel doors, side by side, both closed, both sealed with combination dials. And in the center of the room, occupying the space with the quiet authority of something that had been waiting a long time, a wooden desk, simple, oak like the workbench, with a single drawer and nothing on its surface except a letter. The envelope was yellowed but intact, in Emmett's handwriting on the front, in ink that had faded to the color of old rust. For whoever finds this, read before you open anything. Nora's hands were completely steady when she picked it up. She did not know why they were steady. Adrenaline, probably, or the particular calm that comes on the other side of it. She pulled a stool from under the workbench, sat down, and opened the envelope. The letter was dated April 14th, 1963. I am writing this in my 61st year, which means if I live to the age my father did, I have perhaps 10 years left, and if I am lucky, 15. I am writing it now because I have been putting it off for 12 years, which is how long this room has existed under the ground of this farm, and there is no more sense in waiting. My name is Emmett Ray Callahan. I was born in Harlan County in 1902. I have been a farmer my whole life, which means I have been poor my whole life in the way farmers are poor land rich and cash poor, working soil that barely gives back what you put in, watching prices move in directions that have nothing to do with how hard you worked or how well the crop came. I am also a man who went to war. I was 40 when Pearl Harbor happened and 41 when they took me anyway because I had mechanical aptitude and they needed men who could fix things. I spent 2 years in the Pacific working on equipment. I was not a hero. I fixed what needed fixing. But the work took me places and showed me things I would not have seen otherwise. And in 1944, in circumstances that I have spent 19 years deciding how to describe, I came into the possession of something I had no right to by the standards of ordinary accounting, but which I could not in good conscience leave where it was. What it was, and what it became, and why it is here, I will try to explain. In the summer of 1944, I was stationed briefly at a naval facility on a small island whose name I cannot write down and whose location I cannot describe, even now. During the construction of a supply depot, the crew I was attached to broke through the floor of a pre-war Japanese military installation and found a room. In that room were items that had been stored during the Japanese occupation of territories across the Pacific, items that had been taken from civilian populations, from religious institutions, from cultural sites, from private individuals who had no power to refuse. Some were gold bars and coins. Some were gemstones. Some were objects of cultural significance whose origins I could not identify. Some were currency from multiple nations. The Navy's official position was that the discovery would be processed through channels. Processed meant distributed among people with the authority to distribute it, which meant it would not return to the families it had been taken from. I knew this. Everyone in that crew knew this. I took what I could carry in a sea bag over 2 trips. I am not proud of this decision in an uncomplicated way. I stole from a theft. Whether that makes what I did wrong or partially right is a question I have argued with myself for 19 years and have not resolved. I brought what I had taken back to Kentucky. I built this room to keep it safe until I could figure out what ought to be done with it. That was in 1951. 12 years later, I still do not know. Here is what I do know. The gold and the currency belonged to no government and no individual who could be identified. Whatever process the Navy would have run in 1944 would not have returned these things to their source. I have kept them in better condition than that process would have. The objects, the things that are not gold and not currency, some of these may have origins that could be traced. I have attempted, over many years, to understand what I have and where it came from. My research is in the filing cabinet beside the left wall. My conclusions are incomplete. Someone with more resources and knowledge than I have should continue this work. I am leaving this room to whoever in my family finds it. I am not telling my children because I do not trust what greed does to people, and I have seen what it does to my children, and I love them too much to do that to them. So I am leaving it to chance, which is another word for faith. If you are reading this, the chance found you. The combinations to the inner vaults are as follows. Left door, the year my wife Loretta was born, followed by the number of acres in this farm when I bought it, followed by the year I came home from the war. Right door. The year my first child was born, followed by the number of pigs we kept the winter of 1949. I have written this in my farming log for that year, which is in the filing cabinet, followed by the year this room was completed. Do not tell anyone until you understand what you have. There are people who look for things like this. They have been looking since before I built this room. They may still be looking. I am sorry for the weight of this. I am also glad it is yours. Emmett Ray Callahan, April 14th, 1963. Nora read the letter twice. The second time more slowly, pausing at specific sentences the way you pause at places on a map you want to be sure you're reading correctly. Then she sat for a moment in the underground room her grandfather had built with reinforced concrete and military-grade shelving, under a pig pen that the county assessor had assigned no value, that her brothers had not wanted, that her father had apparently known nothing about, or had known everything about, and chosen to leave to the one child he'd given the least to. And she could not yet tell which of those possibilities was true, or whether it mattered. She checked her phone. 23 minutes since she'd spoken to Deb. She called back. Deb answered before the first ring finished. You're alive. I'm alive. What is it? What did you find? Nora looked at the rows of crates along the left wall, at the filing cabinet, at the two sealed vault doors at the far end of the room, at the letter in her hand, written by a man who had been dead since 1979, who had spent 19 years arguing with himself and come to no conclusion except that he trusted chance more than he trusted his own children. She said, I don't know yet. I need to come back. I need to bring some people. What kind of people? The kind who know what things are worth. And maybe a lawyer. A pause. Nora, are you okay? She looked at the letter again. At the single sentence she kept returning to, the one that had no ambiguity in it at all. I am leaving it to whoever in my family finds it. I think so, she said. I think I might be better than okay. I just don't know by how much yet. She spent 40 minutes in the room before she made herself leave. She did not open any of the crates. She did not try the vault combinations. She didn't have the farming log that held one piece of the code, and she wasn't going to try without it. She walked the perimeter of the main room, counted the crates, 31, of varying sizes, each labeled in Emmett's handwriting with notations she could not fully parse, abbreviations, reference numbers, descriptions that ranged from the specific to the cryptic. She examined the filing cabinet, which was unlocked and held 12 folders, each labeled, each thick with papers she did not yet touch. She photographed everything. 216 photographs on her phone, methodical and overlapping. The way she kept records of everything important in her life: receipts, school forms, lease agreements, the spreadsheet on her phone. You documented because documentation was the difference between having something and being able to prove you had something. And Nora Callahan had learned early that the latter was often more important than the former. Before she left, she stood at the desk and looked at the letter one more time. Her grandfather had been 61 when he wrote it. He had carried this for 12 years before committing it to paper. He had died 16 years after writing it without ever telling anyone, carrying it for 28 years in total. This secret that was also a decision that was also, she was beginning to understand, a form of trust. I am leaving it to chance, which is another word for faith. She refolded the letter, put it in her jacket pocket, pulled the vault door shut behind her, and climbed back up the stairs into the cold. She replaced the hatch. She moved the broken trough section back against the wall. She locked the gate behind her and walked back to the car. She sat in the Civic for a few minutes with the engine running and the heat on, looking at her phone at the photographs she'd taken. 31 crates, 2 sealed vaults, 12 folders of documentation assembled by a man who had decided, after 28 years of deliberation, that the right answer was whoever finds this. She thought about the spreadsheet on her phone, the color-coded cells, the yellow and the red. The check engine light that had been on so long it had become invisible. She thought about Lily's school bus at 3:30. She put the car in drive and began the 4-hour trip back to Lexington. The farming log was not supposed to be easy to find. Nora had known this before she started looking, because her grandfather had been a deliberate man, careful about what he left visible and what he kept obscured. The log for 1949 that held the pig count was the key to one of the vault combinations, which meant it had to exist somewhere accessible, but it would not be sitting out in the obvious places. It would be where a specific kind of person would find it, and a general kind of person would not. She had no claim to any property except Parcel C. The farmhouse and its contents now belonged to Dennis. The outbuildings and their contents belonged to Paul. She called Dennis on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after her first visit to the pig pen, using a careful voice she'd been practicing. She told him she'd been going through some things related to settling her portion of the estate, and she was looking for records her grandfather had kept, farming logs, specifically from the late 1940s. Old stuff, nothing of monetary value. She was just interested in the family history. Could she come look through the things in the farmhouse study? She wouldn't be long. Dennis said he didn't see why not, in a tone that suggested he'd already decided there was nothing in the study worth protecting, which was exactly the conclusion she had been hoping he'd reached. She drove to Harlan County on a Saturday in early March, and Dennis let her in and offered her coffee she didn't want and stood in the doorway of the study for a few minutes before losing interest and going back to whatever he'd been doing. She stood alone in her father's study, her grandfather's study before that, surrounded by almanacs and seed catalogs and the accumulated paper life of 3 generations of Callahan men. The farming logs were in a section of the bookshelf that had been organized, she could see, by her grandfather rather than her father. The same leftward slanting handwriting on the spines, the same black leather covers, dates stamped in gold that had mostly gone to bronze. They ran from 1937 to 1978, 1 volume per year, without gaps. She found 1949 and opened it. It was exactly what it presented itself to be, a farmer's record of the year. Weather entries, planting dates, yield notations, equipment repairs, financial summaries by quarter. And in an entry for December 12, 1949, winter inventory complete. Cattle, 14. Chickens, 47. Hogs in the South Pen, 23. 23 pigs. In the winter of 1949. She photographed the page. She replaced the log on the shelf in exactly the position she'd found it. She thanked Dennis on her way out and drove back to Lexington with the number 23 sitting in her chest like something she'd swallowed that hadn't fully settled yet. 3 nights later, at the kitchen table after Lily was asleep, she worked through the combinations. Left door, Loretta's birth year. She knew this. Her grandmother Loretta had been born in 1904, a date she'd seen in the family Bible that lived in her mother's house. 1904, number of acres when Emmett bought the farm. She found this in the county deed records she'd already pulled. 140 acres, purchased 1928. 140, year Emmett came home from the war. She knew this too, from her mother's stories. 1945. Left combination, 1904, 140, 1945. Right door, first child's birth year. Emmett's oldest was Gerald, her father. Born 1931, she had his birth certificate in a file her mother had given her years ago. 1931. Number of pigs in winter, 1949, 23. Year the room was completed, 1951, the year of the building permit. Right combination, 1931, 23, 1951. She wrote them down on a piece of paper. Then she thought better of it and memorized them instead and burned the paper over the kitchen sink, which was perhaps dramatic, but Emmett's letter had said there are people who look for things like this, and she had decided to take that seriously until she had reason not to. She called a real estate attorney in Lexington named Patricia O'Hara, who had a reputation for being competent and not alarmist, and told her she had a situation involving an inherited property and some items she'd discovered on it, and she needed to understand her legal position before she took any further steps. Patricia O'Hara said she could see her Tuesday. Nora took Tuesday off from the dental office and arranged backup for the school bus. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Nora brought the deed, the letter, and the photographs. Patricia O'Hara read the letter twice, looked at the photographs carefully, and then sat back in her chair and said, "Tell me everything. From the beginning. Leave nothing out." Nora told her. Patricia O'Hara made notes. She asked questions. She asked about the building permit, which Nora had also pulled and brought. She asked about the provenance language in Emmett's letter, about the phrase "came into the possession of," about the reference to the naval installation and the chain of custody since 1944. When Nora finished, Patricia said, "Okay, there are several distinct legal questions here. Ownership of the contents as inherited property is the first and simplest. What you inherited under the deed is the parcel and any fixtures and contents on or under it at the time of conveyance. That's your starting point. The more complicated questions relate to provenance, where these objects came from, whether there are existing claims, what obligations might attach to their possession. She folded her hands on the desk. You need an appraisal before you go back in there. And you need it done by someone who understands that confidentiality isn't optional. I wasn't planning to tell anyone. Good. How close are you to the rest of your family? Nora looked at her. My brother's got the farm. My sister got the timber. How close? Patricia repeated. Nora thought about Dennis's voice on the phone saying, I don't see why not. Already sure there was nothing worth protecting. She thought about Karen's hand on her shoulder in the parking lot saying these things are always complicated. She thought about Paul, who had not said anything at all. Not close, she said. Not at all. Patricia O'Hara nodded once, the way someone nods when they've received a piece of information that changes the shape of what they're planning. That's probably the only thing about this situation that's actually simple, she said. Let's talk about next steps. Outside the attorney's office, Nora sat in the Civic in the parking garage for a few minutes. The check engine light glowed orange. The passenger window let in a thread of cold air at the corner where the seal had failed. She pulled out her phone and opened the spreadsheet. The color-coded cells, the yellow and the red. Then she opened the photographs from the pig pen. 31 crates, 2 sealed vaults, a filing cabinet with 12 folders, a letter from a dead man who had spent 28 years looking for the right person to leave something to and had settled, finally, on chance. She looked at the photographs for a long time. She thought about what Patricia O'Hara had said about ownership. What you inherited under the deed is the parcel and any fixtures and contents on or under it at the time of conveyance. Clear language. Unambiguous. The kind of language that in Nora's experience meant something until the moment someone with more money decided it meant something different, and then you needed to be ready for that, which meant you needed to know what you had before anyone else did, which meant the next step was going back. She started the car. She had a school bus to meet. She went back on a Wednesday. She had chosen Wednesday specifically because it was the one day of the week where her schedule had a natural gap between 9:15, when the bakery shift ended, and 1 o'clock, when she needed to be back in Lexington for a dental office afternoon shift that she could not afford to miss. 4 hours, minus driving time on either end, which gave her roughly 2 hours on the ground. She had packed a flashlight, a notepad, a measuring tape, a headlamp she'd borrowed from Deb, and a thermos of coffee. She had charged her phone to 100%. She had photographed the combinations from her memory onto a piece of paper, sealed it in an envelope, and left it with Patricia O'Hara's office with instructions that it was not to be opened unless Nora failed to call in by 6 that evening. Patricia had accepted this without commentary, which was one of the things Nora had decided she liked about her. The morning was cold but clear. The drive took 2 hours and 11 minutes. She parked on the county road as she had before, walked the track to the gate, unlocked it, and stood in the entrance of the pig pen looking at the broken trough and the drainage grate and the particular quality of silence that had begun to feel, over the past several weeks, less like neglect and more like something that had been deliberate. Emmett Callahan had not been careless. She understood this better now, having spent weeks with his farming logs and his building permits and the 4 letters she'd found from him in her grandmother's papers, which her mother had kept in a box in a closet and which Nora had sat with one Sunday afternoon while Lily was at a birthday party. Emmett's carelessness was surface only, the cracked trough, the rusted gate, the corrugated tin that looked like it might blow off in a strong wind. Beneath that surface was a man who had calculated everything to the inch and the decade. The deterioration was managed, she thought now. Just enough to discourage. Not enough to collapse. She moved the trough section. She lifted the hatch. The air that came up was the same. Clean, regulated, slightly warm. The lights came on in sequence as she descended. She stood in the main room for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the familiar layout. 31 crates along the left wall. Filing cabinet. Workbench. The 2 doors at the far end. The desk with nothing on it now except the slight rectangle where the envelope had rested for 61 years. She went to the left door first. The combination dial was the same style as an old bank safe, heavy, steel, with raised numbers, a satisfying mechanical resistance as she turned it. She worked through the sequence slowly. 1904, turning to the first number, then left, 140, then right, 1945. She felt the last tumbler engage before she heard it, a sensation through her fingers rather than a sound, and then the lever moved, and the door opened. The room beyond was smaller than the main chamber, perhaps 15 feet square, and the air inside was several degrees cooler, dry in a way that was almost crisp. The shelving here was different from the main room. Metal, sealed unit construction, each shelf enclosed behind glass panels that she suspected were not ordinary glass. Climate-controlled display cases, essentially, built into the wall like a series of windows onto whatever they held. She turned on her headlamp and moved closer. The first case held coins. She could see that immediately: the metallic sheen, even in dim light, the stacked arrangement, the individual plastic sleeves that each coin had been sealed in. She counted rows, 12 rows, 8 coins per row, 3 deep. The sleeves were clear enough that she could see the surface detail on the face-up coins, writing she couldn't read, profiles she didn't recognize, the particular weight of old gold and the way it caught light differently from modern metal. The label on the shelf edge was in Emmett's handwriting. Gold coinage, various national origins, pre-1940. See File 3 for individual documentation. The second case held bars. 8 of them, stacked in 2 columns of 4, each with a paper tag attached by wire. She leaned close to read the tags. Weights in grams, purity notations, a symbol she didn't immediately recognize but would later identify as a Japanese imperial mint mark. The third case held something she had not expected: a tray of loose stones, each seated in a small velvet. Depression, each tagged with a handwritten label too small to read from outside the glass. They ranged in color from clear to amber to deep green. Some were cut, some were rough. They had been arranged with the same methodical care as everything else in this room, which meant Emmett had understood what he had, or had worked until he understood it. The fourth case. More coins, these ones silver, larger, a different origin. The fifth case. Currency. Stacked in banded notes in denominations and languages she couldn't identify from a distance, preserved behind glass in the same careful organization as everything else. She stood in the doorway of this room for a long time. She did not touch anything. She photographed everything: the cases, the labels, the layout, the door itself, and its combination mechanism. She counted and recounted and made notes in the notepad she'd brought. Then she sealed the door behind her and went to the right. The right vault opened on the second try. She transposed 2 digits the first time and had to start the sequence over, which cost her 3 minutes. She tracked with the awareness of someone who had only 2 hours and could not afford to be careless. When it opened, the air was different again. Not cool like the left vault, but warmer, controlled to a temperature she would later learn was the standard archival specification for organic materials. Wooden shelving here, not metal and glass. Wide, shallow drawers stacked in units along 3 of the 4 walls, each drawer labeled, each label in Emmett's handwriting. Against the 4th wall, standing upright in padded frames, were objects she had no immediate framework for. Panels, she thought at first, boards, except that boards did not have that surface, that layered quality of something that had been worked and reworked until the surface was its own kind of depth. Paintings, 8 of them, in varying sizes, each in a padded frame designed for safe storage. Each with a tag. She moved toward them carefully, as though speed might damage something. She turned her headlamp to its lowest setting because she had read, during the 3 weeks between her first visit and this one, that direct bright light was among the things you did not do near old paintings, particularly ones that had been sealed in a climate-controlled environment and had not seen the outside world in decades. The first tag read, "Oil on panel, Flemish, circa 1580 to 1620. Female portrait, unknown subject. Acquired source notation in File 7. Condition, excellent." She did not know enough to evaluate the claim. What she could see, even in the low light, even with no expertise whatsoever, was that the surface had a quality different from reproduction: a texture, a variation, a sense of the paint having been applied by a hand that was navigating something rather than copying something. She had been to museums twice in her life, both times on school trips, and she remembered the way the real things looked different from photographs in a way she hadn't expected, a difference she hadn't had language for. This had that quality. The second, oil on canvas, Dutch school, circa 1640. Still life, flowers and fruit. Acquired source notation in File 7. Condition, very good, minor craquelure. Third, oil on panel, Italian, circa 1490 to 1510. Religious subject, Madonna and child. Acquired source notation in File 7. Condition, excellent. Some retouching visible under UV. She stopped at the third one. Looked at the date range. Looked at the notation Italian, circa 1490 to 1510, which described a period of art history she was not expert in, but which she had spent parts of the past 3 weeks reading about. The late 15th century into the early 16th. Italy. The period that produced names she recognized even from 2 school trips and 37 years of a life not organized around art. She looked at the painting for a very long time. The label did not make a claim she wasn't qualified to make. It said Italian, circa 1490 to 1510, and left the attribution open, which was either Emmett's caution or Emmett's uncertainty, and she could not yet tell which. The filing cabinet in the main room held 12 folders, and one of them was labeled File 7. She photographed everything in the right vault. She counted the shallow drawers, 22 of them, various sizes, and photographed the label of each without opening any, because Patricia O'Hara had said don't disturb anything with enough emphasis that it had settled into Nora's approach the way practical advice settled when it came from someone competent. You documented first. You understood later. She sealed the right vault and went back to the main room and stood at the filing cabinet. File 7 was the thickest of the 12 folders. She lifted it out and opened it on the desk. It was organized chronologically, beginning in 1951, continuing through entries dated as recently as 1977, 2 years before Emmett's death. Each entry documented a specific item in the right vault: provenance research, acquisition notes, the source notations she'd seen referenced on the painting tags. Emmett had not had access to institutional databases or academic archives, but he had corresponded with people who did. Letters, some in English and some in German and one in Italian, from individuals at universities and museums, all phrased carefully, all circling questions about specific styles and periods without ever identifying the actual items he was researching. He had been doing this for 26 years, quietly, through correspondence, building a record that he knew would be incomplete, but that was as complete as one man in rural Kentucky could make it without revealing what he had. The Italian panel was addressed in an entry from 1968. Emmett had written, in his careful leftward slant, correspondence with Dr. R. Hartmann, Munich, confirms stylistic attribution consistent with Northern Italian school, late 15th to early 16th century. Hartmann suggests possibility of Perugino workshop or associated studio based on composition and coloring. Cannot confirm without examination. Hartmann asks where I have seen the work. I have told him a private collection. He is not pressed. Perugino workshop. If correct, value conservatively estimated at several $100,000 by Hartmann's indirection. Possibly higher. Do not speculate. Document. She read this 3 times. She sat with it for a moment. Then she checked the time. 1 hour and 4 minutes had passed since she'd descended the stairs. She photographed the relevant pages of File 7, replaced it in the cabinet, and took a final set of photographs of the main room. She made herself do this methodically, without rushing, because rushing led to missing things, and missing things was a luxury she could not afford. On her way out, she paused at the crates along the left wall. Emmett's labels were terse but consistent. Category, origin note, file reference. She found references to File 3, File 4, File 5, File 6, and File 9 on various crates. She had not opened any of the files except 7. She had not opened any of the crates. She had not touched anything she did not need to touch. She climbed the stairs. She sealed the hatch. She moved the trough back into position. She stood in the pig pen in the cold March morning and called Patricia O'Hara. I'm out, she said. You can stand down on the envelope. Good. How did it go? There are paintings, Nora said. I think one of them might be old. Very old. A pause. How old are we talking? She looked at her notepad. At the words she'd written from Emmett's file. Perugino workshop. Late 15th, early 16th century. I'm not certain. But Emmett Callahan was certain enough to spend 26 years corresponding with people in Munich about it. The pause on Patricia's end was longer this time. I'm going to make some calls, she said finally. Don't go back in there without telling me first. The appraiser Patricia found was named Calvin Marsh, and he arrived in Harlan County on a Friday morning in early April in a vehicle that was newer and cleaner than anything Nora had seen on the county road in years. He was 60-something, gray-haired, with the specific kind of unhurried manner that Nora associated with people who had seen enough remarkable things that they'd stopped performing surprise. He carried 2 cases of equipment and wore clothes that were practical rather than impressive, which she took as a good sign. He had, Patricia had told her, appraised collections for 3 major auction houses and consulted for 2 federal agencies on matters involving disputed cultural property. He was expensive. He was discreet. He had signed a confidentiality agreement before Patricia had given him the address. Nora met him at the gate. She had not told her brothers or her sister she was returning to the property. She had told no one except Deb, who was watching Lily for the day, and Patricia, who was in the car behind Calvin Marsh's. She showed him down the stairs. Calvin Marsh descended without comment. He stood in the main room and turned in a slow circle, his equipment cases still in his hands, and did not say anything for almost a full minute. Then, your grandfather built this in 1951. Yes. He maintained it himself until his death. As far as I can determine, yes. The ventilation system runs on a separate electrical circuit connected to the main farm. I found the connection in the utility records. It's been drawing power continuously since 1952. He looked at the ceiling fixtures. The climate control in the vaults as well? I assume so. Everything appears functional. He set down his cases. Show me the right vault first. She worked the combination. The door opened. Calvin Marsh stepped inside, set down his cases, and became a different person, or rather, became more fully himself, the unhurried manner replaced by something more precise, more focused. He put on cotton gloves before he touched anything. He produced a small UV lamp and a magnifying loupe in a device she didn't recognize that turned out to be a portable spectrometer. He spent 40 minutes in the right vault. Nora stood in the doorway and watched without speaking, which was what he'd asked her to do. When he came to the Italian panel, he stopped. He examined it for longer than he'd examined the others. He used the UV lamp at several angles. He used the spectrometer on an edge of the panel where the paint had lifted slightly, which she guessed was the minor retouching visible under UV that Emmett had noted in 1968. He made notes on a small recorder rather than paper, speaking in a low voice she could not quite hear. At the end of the 40 minutes, he sealed the vault and came to stand beside her in the main room. He looked at the left vault door. Left one next. He spent 30 minutes in the left vault, working methodically through each case, cataloging with the recorder, using the spectrometer on the coins and the bars, holding individual gemstones up to his loupe in the headlamp light. He did not hurry. He did not express anything she could read. When he came out, he said, "The filing cabinet. I need to see the documentation." She gave him access to all 12 folders. He worked through them at the desk, reading and recording, occasionally pausing at something long enough to make her want to ask a question and consistently deciding against it. She sat on the workbench stool and drank her thermos coffee and waited. After an hour and 20 minutes, Calvin Marsh put the last folder back in the cabinet, removed his gloves, and turned to look at her. "I'm going to give you preliminary numbers," he said. "These will change once I've done full laboratory analysis on the materials and more complete research on the provenance documentation. But you asked for a preliminary assessment, and I'll give you one." She nodded. "The coins in the left vault. I've identified 4 distinct groupings. Pre-war Japanese gold coinage, Philippine minted under American occupation, Dutch East Indian colonial issue, and miscellaneous Pacific regional. The gold content alone, without numismatic premium, is substantial. Conservative estimate on the collection as gold, between $4 and $6 million. Numismatic premium for the identifiable rare issues could add another $2 to $4 million. Call it $6 to $10 million, pending full catalog." He let that number sit in the room for a moment before continuing. "The bars, 8 bars of high-purity gold, Japanese imperial mint. Approximately 12 kilos each. At current spot price, roughly $900,000 per bar. 8 bars, call it $7.2 million. Clean number, will not change significantly with further analysis. The gemstones. This is the area of greatest range in my preliminary estimate. I've identified what appear to be 14 emeralds of Colombian origin, 9 rubies consistent with Burmese sourcing, and approximately 40 diamonds of varying cut and quality. The emeralds and rubies are the notable items. If the origin attributions hold under full analysis, you are looking at pieces that will attract serious collector attention. Preliminary range, 3 to 8 million, with the upper end requiring the origin attributions to hold. Currency. The banknotes are significant as historical artifacts more than as redeemable currency. Many of the issuing bodies no longer exist. Collector value for the complete collection, 1 to 2 million. Possibly higher if there are rarities I didn't identify on preliminary examination. She had been keeping a running total in her head the way she kept running totals of everything, and the number she'd arrived at was somewhere between 17 and 27 million, and that number was already making her feel physically strange in a way she couldn't describe. Then Calvin Marsh said, "The right vault is a different matter." He looked at his notes. 7 of the 8 paintings are attributable to the Flemish and Dutch schools of the 16th and 17th centuries with reasonable confidence. 2 of the 7 are, in my preliminary assessment, likely to be works by artists whose names you would recognize. I'm not going to name them until I've done proper analysis, because preliminary attributions in this category have a way of creating problems before they solve them. What I'll say is that the combined preliminary value of the 7 absent the 8th is in the range of $20 to $40 million, with that range driven almost entirely by whether the 2 notable attributions hold. He paused. The 8th painting is the Italian panel. She waited. I've spent time with a great many works from the late 15th and early 16th century, Calvin Marsh said. I have examined works from the studios of the major Florentine and Umbrian masters of that period. I have seen authenticated works by Perugino, by Ghirlandaio, by Botticelli, by their contemporaries and students and assistants. He stopped. I'm not prepared to make a formal attribution today. What I will tell you is that the panel before me is, in my professional opinion, not a workshop piece. It is not a copy. It is not a product of studio assistants working from a master's design. The handling is too individual. The decisions are too specific. Whatever this is, a principal hand made it. If the attribution I suspect is confirmed under full scientific analysis, and I am telling you clearly that confirmation is not certain, that this kind of attribution requires months of work by multiple specialists, you will be dealing with a work whose value is not measured in millions. Nora's voice came out even when she spoke, which surprised her. What is it measured in? Calvin Marsh looked at her with an expression she would later describe to Deb as the face of a man deciding how much reality another person can hold. If confirmed, he said carefully, and I want you to hear the if you would be in the range of $150 to $250 million. For the single painting. Auction. If you chose auction, possibly higher in a private treaty sale to the right institutional buyer. The room was quiet. The ventilation system hummed at a frequency she'd stopped hearing and now heard again. $150 million. For the single painting. Underneath a pig pen in Harlan County, Kentucky, sealed since 1944, maintained by a dead man's mechanical ingenuity and a separate electrical circuit nobody had thought to question. She said, I need you to tell me what happens next. Next, Calvin Marsh said, we do this properly. Full scientific analysis. Complete provenance research. Legal review of ownership chain and any potential claims. This process takes months, and it is not optional. Any attempt to sell or transfer a work of this potential significance without complete provenance documentation would be, at best, financially catastrophic and at worst, criminal. Your attorney understands this. I will work with her directly. In the meantime, he continued, nothing leaves this vault. Nothing is discussed outside this room except through your attorney. And I would recommend that you tell no one, not family, not friends, not anyone, the nature of what you have found until the legal and provenance framework is in place. She thought about Dennis's voice. Paul's silence. Karen's hand on her shoulder. These things are always complicated, Karen had said. I haven't told anyone, Nora said. Calvin Marsh nodded once. Good. Keep it that way. The complications began not because Nora told anyone, but because Emmett Callahan had not been as invisible as he thought. It started with a letter. Not to Nora, to Patricia O'Hara's office, addressed to the legal representative of the Callahan estate, Harlan County parcel interests, which was language specific enough that someone had done research before writing it. The letter was from a law firm in Louisville, Hendricks, Voss and Associates, representing a client they declined to name, expressing interest in discussing any recently identified assets associated with the Callahan farm properties and requesting a meeting at the firm's earliest convenience. Patricia called Nora the morning the letter arrived. How would they know? Nora asked. Power draw, Patricia said. The separate electrical circuit you mentioned, it's been drawing consistent power for 70 years. That kind of anomalous consumption on a property that's been in probate transition would flag on a utility audit. Or it could be something else. The county deed transfer for Parcel C is public record. Someone paying attention to the Callahan estate during probate might have noticed the specific exclusion of that parcel from the primary distribution. Someone paying attention. Who would pay attention to a pig pen? Someone who already knew what was under it. That sentence sat in Nora's chest for a long moment. Emmett's letter said there were people looking. Yes, Patricia said. It did. The law firm declined to identify their client when Patricia requested it. They cited confidentiality. They were polite about it. The specific politeness of a letter written by someone who knows they hold leverage and is content to wait for you to recognize it. They suggested a preliminary meeting to explore areas of mutual interest. Patricia wrote back acknowledging receipt and indicating that her client would require disclosure of the opposing party's identity before any meeting could be scheduled. The response came in 4 days. The client's name was Whitmore Cultural Holdings, LLC, a Delaware-registered entity whose publicly available information described it as a private equity vehicle specializing in alternative asset acquisition and cultural property investment. Nora looked up Whitmore Cultural Holdings on her phone at the kitchen table while Lily drew tornado diagrams on graph paper at the other end. Delaware, LLC. Registered 2019. No public principals. The registered agent was a law firm that appeared to represent dozens of similar entities. She looked up the law firm. Hendricks, Voss & Associates, Louisville. Established 1988. Commercial real estate, estate law, asset recovery. The phrase asset recovery appeared in their practice description in language that was carefully neutral but suggested, to Nora's reading, a specific kind of work. Finding things that had been lost or misplaced, or she thought of Emmett's letter hidden. She called Patricia back. They've been looking for this, she said. Specifically, that would be my read. Which means they have information about what's in the vault. Or they have a theory based on enough information to make it worth hiring a Louisville law firm. What do they want? The letter doesn't say explicitly, but the phrase areas of mutual interest in that context means they want to negotiate a claim to part or all of what you've found. Whether their claim is legitimate or speculative is what we need to determine. How do I determine that? By not meeting with them, not responding in substance, and letting me do the legal research on any potential claims while Calvin finishes the provenance work. If Whitmore has a legitimate legal basis for a claim, it will show up in the documentation. If they're fishing, that will show up too. She asked the question. She'd been turning over since she'd first read the letter. Patricia, what claim could they possibly have? A few possible theories, Patricia said. 1. They represent heirs of someone Emmett acquired items from, with a legitimate restitution claim. 2. They represent a government or institutional interest in items with disputed provenance. 3. They have no legitimate claim at all and are hoping that a single mother with no legal resources will settle rather than fight. She paused. Historically, option 3 has worked quite often. Not this time. No, Patricia said. I rather thought not. Calvin Marsh's preliminary report arrived 6 weeks later, 43 pages, bound. Delivered to Patricia's office by courier with a cover letter indicating that the full scientific analysis would require additional time, but that the preliminary findings were sufficiently significant to warrant early review. Nora read it at Patricia's conference table on a Saturday afternoon, while Lily was at Deb's house, and Deb was being owed another favor that Nora was adding to the list she kept of obligations, a list that had been growing for 6 years, and that she had always intended to pay back when she had the means, and had not yet had the means. The preliminary report confirmed Calvin's verbal assessment and extended it. The gold holdings bars and coins combined were cataloged in enough detail to produce a range of $14 to $18 million, the variance driven by numismatic factors that would require further specialized appraisal. The gemstone collection was partially analyzed. 3 of the emeralds identified as Colombian Musaregan origin with clarity grades that placed them in the category of investment stones rather than decorative ones. The preliminary value of those 3 alone was cataloged at $1.2 million. The remaining 11 emeralds and the rubies and diamonds were still pending full grading, but Calvin's projections were consistent with his verbal estimate of $3 to $8 million for the complete set. The currency collection held a surprise. Among the banded notes were 2 packets of pre-war Philippine pesos that had been declared officially destroyed and of which fewer than 50 examples were known to exist in any condition. Collector value for those 2 packets alone, between $600,000 and $1.4 million. Emmett had noted them in File 6 only as Philippine currency, various, which meant either he'd known what he had and been characteristically understated, or he hadn't known and had preserved them by accident, which was its own form of miracle. The painting's report ran to 19 pages. 6 of the 7 Flemish and Dutch works were catalogued with preliminary attributions, 2 of which Calvin had flagged as requiring urgent specialist review. One, a Dutch Golden Age marine scene he believed attributable to a second-tier master whose authenticated works sold regularly at 7 to 12 million, and one, a Flemish portrait he described only as potentially significant, specialist consultation required. The combined preliminary range for the 6, 22 to 38 million. The 7th of the Flemish-Dutch group was a smaller work, oil on panel, that Calvin had identified as almost certainly by a named artist from the Antwerp school, mid-16th century, whose work appeared regularly in major European auction catalogs. Estimated value, 4 to 7 million. Then the Italian panel. Calvin had spent 11 pages on it. Scientific analysis, infrared reflectography, X-ray fluorescence, cross-section analysis of paint layers. He had consulted remotely without revealing the work's location or legal status, with 2 specialists in Italian Renaissance painting, both of whom had responded with what he described, with deliberate understatement, as notable enthusiasm. The panel construction was consistent with late 15th century Umbrian and Tuscan practice. The pigments were consistent with that period and region. The underdrawing, visible under infrared reflectography, showed a compositional process that the specialists had described as highly characteristic of a specific documented working method without yet naming the artist. The paint's surface showed the handling of someone who had mastered a technique so thoroughly that its execution appeared effortless, which was, Calvin noted, one of the paradoxes of attribution work, that mastery was sometimes harder to recognize than effort. His preliminary conclusion, framed with the careful language of someone who understood exactly what claiming too much too early could cost. Based on available evidence, the present work is, in this appraiser's professional opinion, a primary work by a major artist of the Italian Renaissance, not a workshop product, not a copy, not a later period imitation. Full attribution will require additional specialist examination and scientific analysis. This appraiser's working hypothesis, based on stylistic analysis, technical examination, and specialist consultation, is that the work is attributable to the period 1490 to 1510, Umbrian school, and that the principal hand is consistent with documented works by one of the most significant painters of that period. Estimated value pending full attribution. If the attribution is confirmed to the level of scholarly consensus, the work should be expected to achieve between $180 and $240 million in an appropriate sale context. If attribution is partially confirmed, workshop participation established, but primary hand disputed, the range narrows to 60 to 90 million. If attribution is challenged or withdrawn, the work retains value as a significant Italian Renaissance panel, probably 15 to 30 million. This appraiser recommends immediate engagement of specialist conservators for full examination and legal consultation regarding sale options in advance of any public disclosure. Nora put the report down on the conference table and looked at the wall for a moment. The wall was cream-colored, with a framed print of something botanical she had never looked at closely enough to identify. She looked at it now, looked at the individual leaves. Patricia was watching her from across the table. "Are you all right?" Nora thought about the spreadsheet on her phone. The color-coded cells. She thought about the alarm at 4:15. The bakery ovens. The check engine light. The $840 a month that Terrence had not raised in 3 years out of inertia and basic decency she had been careful never to count on continuing. She thought about what her father had decided she was worth. She said, "One painting." Patricia nodded. "One painting, under a pig pen, that nobody wanted." "That's correct." She picked up the report again. She looked at the numbers. All the numbers, added together, in the most conservative column Calvin had produced, 14 million from the gold, 3 million from the gemstones. 1 million from the currency rarities, 22 million from the Flemish and Dutch works, 60 million from the Italian panel at the lowest attribution scenario, $100 million. At the floor, she said, Lily's bus comes at 3:30. She said it not because it was relevant to the conversation, but because it was the thing she had built everything around for 6 years, and it was the first thing her mind went to now. The way you check a load-bearing wall when the house shifts. We have time, Patricia said gently. Nora looked at the numbers again. She thought about Emmett Callahan at his desk, in a room under the ground, writing a letter to no one specific and hoping that the right person would eventually find it. She thought about the phrase he'd used, I am leaving it to chance, which is another word for faith, and she thought about all the ways in which chance had operated to bring this to her specifically. That she had taken the call from Arthur Fitch's office instead of letting it go to voicemail. That she had opened the letter from the county instead of throwing it away. That she had read the building permit carefully enough to notice the foundation depth. That she had gone back to the farmhouse study and found the farming log and stood in front of the right bookshelf and pulled the right year. That she had been the kind of person who pulled the right year. Who read things twice. Who kept color-coded spreadsheets and documented everything and did not let the math lie to her even when the math was bad. Emmett hadn't left this to chance. He'd left it to the person in his family who would do what needed to be done with it. He'd just called that person by the wrong name. Patricia, she said. Yes. Tell me about the letter from Whitmore. They followed up twice. Both times I've responded with the same request for identification of specific claims and legal basis. They haven't provided any. Which means they're fishing. Almost certainly. They know something is there, and they're hoping you don't know what to do with it. What if I do know what to do with it? Patricia looked at her steadily. Then I think the fishing stops and something else starts. Something more direct. How direct? That depends on what leverage they think they have and what they're willing to do with it. A pause. I'd like to bring in a co-counsel who specializes in cultural property law. A woman named Irene Cho, based in Washington. She's handled cases involving post-war asset recovery, government claims, and private title disputes. She's not cheap. Is she good? She's the person I would want if I were you. Nora thought about the spreadsheet. About the cells that were going to change color when she had the means to change them. Bring her in, she said. She was driving home on the interstate when her phone rang. Dennis. She almost let it go and then answered because she had learned that the calls you didn't take had a way of growing into the calls you wished you'd managed earlier. Nora. His voice had the quality of something that had been worked up too. I've been getting some inquiries. About the farm. About the Parcel C situation. She kept her voice level. What kind of inquiries? A law firm out of Louisville. Hendricks Voss something. They reached out to me saying they represent a client interested in the Callahan estate properties, specifically the agricultural outbuildings and associated parcels. They asked if I knew anything about the current status of Parcel C and whether you'd been on the property. She counted 3 seconds before speaking. What did you tell them? I said I hadn't been in contact with you since the will reading. Which is true. A pause. Nora, what's going on? Is there something about that pig pen I don't know about? She thought about Patricia's advice. About Calvin Marsh's advice. About Emmett's advice, written in 1963, which had been, do not tell anyone until you understand what you have. There are people who look for things like this. She understood what she had now. I'm looking into some property questions with my attorney, she said. Standard stuff for settling the estate interest. I'll let you know if anything relevant comes up. Relevant, Dennis said. There was something in the way he said it. A pressure behind the word. Because if there's something valuable on that land, Nora, something that was part of Dad's estate, it's Parcel C, she said. It was conveyed to me in full and final settlement of my interest. That's the language in the will. I know what the language says. I'm saying if there's something there that wasn't properly inventoried, I've got to go. Dennis. I'll be in touch. She ended the call. She drove the remaining 40 minutes to Lexington with both hands on the wheel and the check engine light glowing orange and Emmett's letter in her memory. The specific sentence she returned to most often now. I do not trust what greed does to people, and I have seen what it does to my children. She had not known her grandfather. She had been born 3 years after his death, had grown up with his handwriting in the margins of almanacs and the gift of a name, Nora, which had been his mother's name and which Gerald had given her in one of the few sentimental acts she could attribute to him. She had never heard his voice or sat at his table or watched him work. But she understood him, she thought. She understood the calculations he had made and the faith he had placed in chance, and the 28 years of correspondence and maintenance and deliberate concealment that had been, in the end, a form of patience so profound it looked like stubbornness. He had built the room to last. He had built the hatch to be found only by someone looking for it. He had left the letter for whoever that person turned out to be. She pulled into the apartment parking lot at 3:28. Lily's bus was already at the stop. She got out of the car and walked to the sidewalk and waited. And when Lily came down the bus steps, she was carrying a drawing she'd done in class, a cross-section diagram of a tornado's internal structure, labeled in her careful first-grade handwriting with annotations she'd apparently added herself. "Mom," she said, holding it up, "did you know the wind at the center of a tornado is actually calm? It's called the eye." Nora took the drawing and looked at it. The labeled layers. The calm center. "I didn't know that," she said. "Most people don't," Lily said, with the satisfaction of someone who has organized the world into comprehensible categories. "But it's true." They walked inside together. Nora held the drawing in one hand and thought about Emmett Callahan's room under the ground, the climate-controlled air, the steady hum of a system that had been running for 70 years waiting for someone to find it. The particular calm at the center of something that from the outside looked like chaos or accident or an insult dressed as an inheritance. "I know," she said. "Sometimes the stillest part is the one nobody thinks to look for." Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything. "That's actually really good, Mom." "Thanks, Bug." She unlocked the apartment door. "Come inside. Tell me about your day." The specialist's name was Dr. Adriana Voss, and she came from Florence. Not Hendrix Voss, a different Voss entirely, which Nora noted with the kind of attention she gave to coincidences, which was the same attention she gave to everything. Careful, skeptical, unwilling to conclude until she had more information. Dr. Adriana Voss was 58 years old, a senior conservator at the Opificio del Pitre Dure, which was the Florentine institute responsible for the conservation and scientific study of the city's most significant works of art. She had been recommended by Calvin Marsh through a chain of professional contacts that had required 2 months to assemble, a chain that began in Cincinnati and ended in a phone call conducted partly in English and partly in Italian through a translator Calvin had arranged. She arrived in Harlan County on a Thursday in June carrying 2 cases of equipment that had required a separate cargo allowance on the transatlantic flight, accompanied by a younger colleague named Marco who operated the more complex instruments and who, for the 3 days they worked in the underground room, spoke exclusively Italian and communicated with Nora entirely through expressions, which turned out to be sufficient. Nora had arranged extended coverage for Lily through the first week of summer. A neighbor named Mrs. Garrett who charged $20 a day and who baked things with Lily and taught her card games and who represented, in Nora's private accounting, one of the genuine graces of her particular life. She had taken 3 days of unpaid leave from the dental office, which she could not afford and which she was doing anyway, because some things you stayed for. Dr. Voss descended the stairs without comment, the way Calvin Marsh had, and stood in the main room for a moment and looked at the ventilation system and the lighting and the sealed vault doors, and then she said something in Italian that Marco translated as, he understood what he was doing. Meaning Emmett. Meaning the man who had built this room in 1951 with a 7th-grade education and a sea bag full of things he'd taken from a naval installation on an island he could never name, and who had spent the next 28 years maintaining it with the precision of someone who understood that what he was protecting was not his to damage. Yes, Nora said. He did. The examination of the Italian panel took the better part of 2 full days. Dr. Voss worked with the systematic patience of someone for whom time was a tool rather than a pressure, applying techniques that Calvin had explained to Nora in advance. Infrared reflectography to examine the underdrawing beneath the paint surface, X-ray radiography to reveal the internal structure of the panel, cross-section analysis of paint samples taken from areas of existing damage so small they required magnification to locate, multispectral imaging to separate the paint layers by pigment composition. Nora stayed out of the vault during the examination. She sat in the main room on the workbench stool with her thermos and her notepad and the 12 folders from the filing cabinet, which she had been working through methodically over the past 2 months, building a parallel research file that now ran to 60 pages of her own notes cross-referenced against Emmett's documentation. She had found a researcher at the University of Kentucky who specialized in Pacific War history and who had helped her, without knowing why she was asking, trace the chain of military installations on a certain unnamed island in the summer of 1944. She had found a genealogical researcher who had traced, through Japanese imperial military records available through a Tokyo archive, the chain of custody for certain categories of cultural property seized during the Pacific occupation. She had done this the way she did everything, methodically, one piece at a time, building toward a picture she didn't yet fully have, but that was becoming clearer with each edition. On the afternoon of the second day, Dr. Voss came out of the vault and stood at the desk and was quiet for a moment in the particular way of someone assembling words for something they want to say correctly. She spoke in Italian. Marco translated. The panel is Umbrian, late 15th century, the period between 1493 and 1504 based on the technical evidence. The pigments are consistent with documented usage from the Perugia workshops of that period. The underdrawing shows a compositional method documented in 3 other works whose attribution is not disputed. A pause. The hand is not Peruginos. Nora waited. The hand is his student's. His most significant student, who worked in his workshop until approximately 1504 and then established his own practice in Florence. A student who became, in the years after leaving Perugino, one of the most celebrated painters of the Italian Renaissance. Dr. Voss looked at her directly. The hand is Raphael's. The room was quiet. The ventilation system hummed. Marco was watching her with the expression of someone who had been present for significant moments before and had learned not to fill them with unnecessary sound. Nora said, "You're certain?" Dr. Voss said something that Marco translated as, "I have spent 30 years studying the technical evidence of this period and these artists. I am as certain as the evidence allows, which is to say I am certain enough that I will put my name and my institution's name on the attribution." Another pause. This is a Raphael. It has been sitting in a concrete room in Kentucky since 1951, and it is in better condition than 3 of the authenticated Raphaels currently on display in European museums. The number Calvin Marsh had given at the high end of his preliminary estimate was $240 million. The number that Irene Cho, the cultural property attorney, put in front of Nora at their first meeting after the attribution was confirmed was different. The last authenticated Raphael to come to auction, Irene said, sold for $212 million. That was 7 years ago. The market for works of this period and significance has moved since then. We are likely looking at a floor of $250 million in a properly managed sale. The ceiling is speculative, but I would not be surprised by 300. Nora sat with that number. $300 million. For one painting. A painting that had come to Harlan County, Kentucky in a sea bag, that had been sealed in a concrete room for 70 years, that had come to her because her father had decided she was worth a pig pen. She said, "What about the rest of the collection?" Irene's additional specialists had completed their work in the weeks since the attribution. The Flemish portrait Calvin had flagged as potentially significant had been confirmed as a work by a named master of the Antwerp school, authenticated and valued at $16 million. The Dutch marine scene was confirmed and valued at $11 million. The remaining 5 Flemish and Dutch works range from $2 to $7 million each. The Italian panel aside, the paintings totaled between $42 and $58 million. The gold, bars, and complete coin collection came to $17.3 million at current market. The gemstones, fully graded, came to $6.8 million, the Colombian emeralds performing at the higher end of Calvin's range. The currency rarities came to $1.1 million. The remaining contents of the crates objects of cultural and historical significance that would require separate handling were assessed at a combined $4 to $9 million, depending on sale mechanism. Total collection value, excluding the Raphael, between $71 and $92 million. Including the Raphael, between $321 and $392 million. $392 million. Possible. Not certain, but possible. Under a pig pen. In Harlan County. No assessed value. Now, Irene said, let's talk about the complications. The complications had been building for months, and they arrived in 3 forms almost simultaneously, the way complications tended to arrive once they understood they were running out of time. The first form was Whitmore Cultural Holdings. Irene had spent 2 months tracing the ownership structure of the Delaware LLC, which had been designed to be untraceable and which was not, quite, because nothing built by human beings was ever quite what it was designed to be. She had found, through a sequence of registered agents and successor entities and a filing error in a 2021 annual report that named an individual where a firm name should have been, that Whitmore Cultural Holdings was ultimately controlled by a man named Jeffrey Ashburn, 64 years old, a private collector based in Nashville who had, according to 3 separate sources Irene had cultivated over a long career, been quietly acquiring information about post-war Pacific asset caches for nearly 20 years. Ashburn was not a criminal, exactly. He was a man who had built a collection of legally acquired art and culturally significant objects through mechanisms that were consistently legal and consistently aggressive, the kind of collector who understood that the space between legally ambiguous and legally defensible was where the significant acquisitions happened. He had been patient with the Callahan situation for years, apparently, which meant he had information that predated the estate transfer and predated Gerald Callahan's death, which meant he had been watching the power draw on Emmett's separate electrical circuit for long enough that the arrival of Nora's name on a deed transfer had triggered a response that was already prepared. Hendricks Voss filed their formal claim in July. The claim was not for ownership of the collection. Ashburn was smarter than that. The claim was for a prior contractual interest in the contents of the property, based on an alleged agreement between Whitmore Cultural Holdings and Gerald Callahan, Nora's father, executed in 2019, 3 years before Gerald's death, in which Gerald had purportedly agreed to convey any items discovered on the farm property to Whitmore in exchange for a payment of $200,000. Nora read the claim at Patricia's conference table and felt something cold move through her chest that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but lived somewhere between them. Did he know, she asked. My father. Did he know what was down there? Patricia and Irene exchanged a look. The agreement refers specifically to any items of historical or monetary significance discovered on or beneath the agricultural parcels of the Callahan farm property, Irene said carefully. That language is specific enough to suggest he had reason to believe there was something to be found. He knew, Nora said. Not a question. The agreement was signed in 2019. Gerald Callahan updated his will in 2021. The update excluded you from the primary estate distribution and conveyed Parcel C to you specifically. Irene paused. There are 2 possible readings of that sequence. Nora saw both of them immediately. Either Gerald had known about the collection and had sold his interest to Ashburn before he died, leaving Nora the parcel as a way of conveying the hatch location to someone who would find it, a twisted form of conscience, passing the discovery to the one person outside the agreement. Or Gerald had known, had sold the interest, and had left her the parcel believing she would find nothing, because the agreement with Ashburn required the seller to convey only what he himself could legally convey, and Gerald could not legally convey what was in the vaults because what was in the vaults had been Emmett's, not his. The third possibility, the one that hurt differently, was that Gerald had known all along, since childhood, and had decided to let Ashburn have it rather than let Nora find it, and had placed the parcel with her believing she would sell it for whatever she could get, unaware that she was the kind of person who read building permits twice. She sat with all 3 possibilities for a moment. Then she said, does the agreement hold legally? Ashburn's position is that it conveys Gerald's interest in whatever was on the property. Our position is that Gerald had no interest to convey, because the vaults and their contents were placed in Emmett's estate separately from the farm property and descended directly to you as the discoverer under the deed language. Irene's voice was steady and precise. It's a legitimate legal dispute. It will not be resolved quickly, but I want you to understand something. Nora waited. Ashburn's agreement, even if it's held to be valid, conveys Gerald's interest. Gerald's interest, as a descendant of Emmett, is one of 4 equal sibling shares, which means Ashburn, at maximum, has a claim to 1/4 of whatever the estate could reach. He does not have a claim to the paintings or the vaults, which were Emmett's property placed in a structure on the land before the farm was ever divided among Gerald's generation. He's bluffing, Nora said. He's overclaiming, Irene said, which is not the same as bluffing. He believes, or his lawyers believe, that the threat of protracted litigation will motivate you to settle, that you will take a fraction of the collection's value to make the dispute go away rather than spend years and significant legal fees fighting it. He doesn't know anything about me. No, Irene said. He doesn't. The second form of complication was Dennis. He called on a Tuesday morning in August, and his voice had a quality she'd never heard from him before. Not the flatness of someone rationing information, but the tightness of someone who had received information he hadn't expected and didn't know how to process. I hired my own attorney, he said, to look at the Parcel C situation. She found the building permit, the foundation depth, a pause, and the separate electrical circuit. Nora let the silence sit for a moment. Okay, Nora, what's down there? She thought about Emmett's letter, about the 28 years he had spent declining to tell his children, about the specific reasoning he had given. I do not trust what greed does to people, and I have seen what it does to my children. His children, Gerald, who had signed an agreement with Jeffrey Ashburn in 2019. Dennis, who had hired an attorney within 8 months of the will reading. Paul, who said nothing and did everything in the silence. She said, "What Parcel C contains is legally mine, Dennis. The deed is clear. Full and final settlement. If there's something valuable that was part of Dad's estate, Parcel C was part of Dad's estate. Everything on and under it came with it. That's standard property law. You're not denying there's something there. I'm not confirming anything to you without my attorney present." A longer pause. You were always like this. Even as a kid. You never just talked to people. She absorbed this. The particular taxonomy of her family's complaints about her had always fascinated her in the way that things fascinate you when they're precise enough to locate something real. She had not just talked to people, it was true. She had listened carefully and spoken when she had something to say and kept her own counsel about the rest, because the alternative, trusting that the people around her would use information well, had not, in her experience, been supported by the evidence. "I'll have my attorney reach out to yours," she said. "Let's do this properly. Nora, take care, Dennis." She ended the call and sat for a moment in the bakery parking lot. 5:15 in the morning, the oven still cooling from the shift, the check engine light doing its thing. She thought about what Irene had said about Ashburn. He believes you will settle rather than fight, and she thought about Dennis, who was making the same calculation from a different direction. Both of them operating on the assumption that Nora Callahan was a person who would give up the thing she'd found rather than hold on to it. They had both made that assumption because she was the one who got the pig pen, because she was the one in the 2-bedroom apartment with the check engine light and the bakery shifts and the child she was raising alone, because she had spent her entire adult life making the math work on numbers that didn't add up, and they had concluded from this that she was the kind of person who could be out-mathematized. They were wrong. The math had never beaten her. She had always found a way through it, not around it, through it, learning exactly where the numbers were and what they meant and how to move them. She was the person who made the math work because the margins were that thin, not in spite of it. She started the car. She had a school bus at 3:30. The Whitmore lawsuit was filed formally in September. Hendricks Voss served the papers to Patricia's office on a Wednesday, and by Thursday afternoon the story had reached a reporter at a Louisville newspaper who wrote a short piece about a disputed estate claim involving potential significant art holdings in eastern Kentucky, which was vague enough to be technically accurate and specific enough that by Monday morning Nora's phone had received 11 calls from numbers she didn't recognize. She answered none of them. The piece did not name the Raphael. It did not name Nora. It referred to a Harlan County property heir and a collection of potentially significant historical value, which was the kind of language that journalists used when they had a source who knew something but wouldn't go on record, which meant Ashburn's people had fed the story, which meant Ashburn wanted pressure, wanted the story in the air, wanted Nora to feel the heat of public attention as an additional incentive to settle. What he had not calculated was that Nora had spent 6 years managing situations on thin margins in real time, and one of the things you learned doing that was that additional pressure was still just pressure. It did not change the underlying math. Irene filed a counter-motion challenging the validity of the Whitmore agreement on 3 grounds. That Gerald Callahan had no legal right to convey assets he did not legally own. That the agreement's language was insufficiently specific to constitute a binding contract under Kentucky law. And that the agreement, to the extent it was valid at all, could convey no more than a fractional share of the assets Emmett's estate could reach. A fraction so small, Irene wrote with the precision of someone who understood the power of arithmetic deployed clearly, as to constitute a claim of no practical significance relative to the collection's value. She also filed, simultaneously, an action against Whitmore Cultural Holdings for tortious interference with Nora's property rights, citing the attempts to approach Dennis and the calculated press leak as evidence of a campaign to coerce settlement through improper means. Ashburn's attorneys had not expected the counteroffensive. You could see it in the timing of their response, which was 11 days rather than the 2 or 3 days of a firm that was ready. When they did respond, the tone had shifted, less confident, more careful, the language of people who had reassessed the opposition and found it more prepared than they'd anticipated. Irene read the response at her Washington office and called Nora. "They're going to offer a settlement," she said, "probably within the month." The tortious interference claim changes their calculation. It means discovery, which means we get to look at everything they know about the collection and how they knew it. They don't want that. What will they offer? Something they think sounds significant. Probably in the range of 10 to 20 million, framed as your share of the collection minus their contractual claim. A pause. I want you to be prepared for the number to feel large even though it isn't. I know what the collection is worth. I know you do. I'm saying that $10 million is a number that has a way of feeling different when it's real rather than theoretical, especially for someone who has been on the color-coded spreadsheet, Nora said. I know. I've thought about it. She had thought about it extensively at the kitchen table at night, with the spreadsheet open beside the photographs from the vault, running the numbers both ways. $10 million, even after taxes, was a number that changed everything. It was Lily's entire future, secured to any reasonable definition of security. It was the check engine light and the bakery alarm and the $840 rent becoming things that had happened rather than things that were happening. It was the gap between the life she'd been maintaining and the life she could build. She thought about it honestly, without the protective detachment of someone who had decided in advance. She sat with the 10 million version and let it be real. And then she went back to Emmett's letter. I took what I could carry in a sea bag over 2 trips. I am not proud of this decision in an uncomplicated way. He had not been proud of it in an uncomplicated way. He had spent 28 years thinking about what ought to be done with it, and he had never resolved the question entirely, and he had been honest about that. He had not rewritten his decision into something simpler than it was. He had documented everything: the purchases, the provenance research, the correspondence, the unanswered questions, because he understood that the complexity was real and that pretending otherwise would be its own kind of theft. She had spent 2 months going through his files. She knew what was in them. She knew which items had origins that were traceable and which did not. She knew which of the crated objects had documentation suggesting they had been taken from individuals or communities who had never recovered them, and she knew which had passed through enough hands in enough chaos that no clean line of ownership existed. She thought about what Emmett had written. Someone with more resources and knowledge than I have should continue this work. She had the resources now. That was what she was deciding, sitting at the kitchen table with the spreadsheet open. She was deciding what kind of person she was when the resources existed. She already knew what kind of person she was when they didn't. She had been proving that for 6 years. She called Irene back. "Don't settle," she said, "and I want to talk about the provenance research." The settlement offer came in October, $15 million, structured as a lump sum, full release of all claims. Irene rejected it without calling Nora. The next offer was $22 million. Irene called about this one. "It's still no," Nora said. "I expected that." A pause. "There's something else. I've been doing the discovery work on the Whitmore agreement. I found the source of Ashburn's information about the collection." She waited. Emmett corresponded with a man in Munich in 1968. A Dr. R. Hartmann, who you found mentioned in File 7. Hartmann died in 1994. His personal papers, including his correspondence files, were acquired by a private archive in Vienna in 2003. That archive was purchased by a holding company in 2011. The holding company is connected to Jeffrey Ashburn through 4 intermediaries. Nora was quiet for a moment. He's had Emmett's letters for 13 years. He's known about the Italian panel for 13 years. He's known the location, Harlan County, Kentucky, the Callahan farm, since at least 2015, when he approached a County Historical Society researcher who had published an article about unusual mid-century construction in the area. Irene's voice was measured, giving the information the weight it deserved without inflating it. "He approached your father in 2019. He's been waiting for the right moment since then. He waited for Gerald to die." Yes. She thought about that. About Jeffrey Ashburn in Nashville, patient for 13 years, watching a separate electrical circuit draw power on a farm in eastern Kentucky, waiting for the old man to go. About her father, who had known or guessed enough to sign an agreement in 2019, and who had died in 2022, and who had left her the pig pen in his will, and who she still could not fully read. Irene, she said, what happens to his claim if we demonstrate he had prior knowledge of the collection and failed to disclose it to my father when negotiating the agreement? A pause. Fraudulent concealment could void the agreement entirely. If Ashburn knew what the collection contained when he negotiated with Gerald and did not disclose that knowledge, the agreement is voidable for failure of good faith. Can you prove it? The Hartmann correspondence in his archive, combined with the timeline of his approach to Gerald, is strongly suggestive. Whether it rises to the level of proof depends on what we find in discovery. Then let's find it. The case did not go to trial. It came close enough that Irene had begun preparing witnesses and Calvin Marsh had cleared his schedule, and the Louisville reporter who had broken the original story had filed 2 additional pieces, each slightly more specific than the last, each drawing on sources that Nora was increasingly certain were inside Ashburn's own legal team, people who were hedging their bets by keeping the press interested. The discovery process produced what Irene had suspected. Internal communications within Ashburn's organization, dating to 2016, that referenced the Hartmann correspondence explicitly, discussed the Italian panel by period and probable attribution, and estimated its value at between $100 and $150 million at that time. These communications predated the approach to Gerald Callahan by 3 years. They demonstrated, clearly enough that Ashburn's own attorneys apparently agreed it was clear, that he had negotiated the 2019 agreement with full knowledge of what he was attempting to acquire and had disclosed none of it. Ashburn dropped the lawsuit on a Thursday morning in November, 14 months after Nora had first stood in the entrance of the pig pen with a gas station coffee and a deed that said no assessed value. His attorney sent a letter. The letter was formal, citing various procedural grounds for withdrawal, and it contained a single sentence at the end that was not procedural. Mr. Ashburn wishes it noted that he considers the Callahan collection to be one of the most significant private holdings of the 20th century and regrets that circumstances did not allow for a more collaborative resolution. Irene read this sentence aloud over the phone, and her tone when she read it was the tone of someone who has heard a man who lost fairly try to sound like he chose to. What does collaborative mean when he was trying to take it from me the whole time? Nora asked. It means he wishes you'd settled, Irene said. Dennis had filed his own claim in September and withdrawn it in October. After 2 conversations with Irene that Nora was not present for, and after which Irene had reported, with the understated precision that was her consistent mode, that Dennis had decided the legal costs of pursuing a claim with limited likelihood of success were not justified by the probable recovery. Paul had never filed anything. Karen had sent a letter through an attorney in November, not a claim, but an inquiry, asking whether there were assets in the estate that had not been accounted for and whether Nora was willing to discuss a family resolution. Nora read Karen's letter twice. She thought about the parking lot after the will reading. These things are always complicated. I'm sure Dad had his reasons. She wrote back herself, not through an attorney, in her own words. Karen, Dad had reasons. I've spent a year figuring out what they were. If you want to have a real conversation about the family, I'm willing. Not about the collection. About the family. Those are different things. Karen called the next day, and they talked for an hour and a half, the longest conversation they'd had in years, and it was difficult and honest in the specific way that conversations are when neither person is performing for the other. Karen said things she had apparently been not saying for a long time. Nora said things she had kept in the filing cabinet of herself, organized by date, never retrieved. They did not resolve everything. Some things do not resolve. They become the ongoing terms of a relationship, the ones you renegotiate as you go. But they were speaking. That was the beginning of something, which was more than it had been. The Raphael was authenticated formally in January, 16 months after Nora had first lifted the hatch. The authentication was issued jointly by Dr. Adriana Voss and the Op Officio del Pitre Dur, co-signed by 2 additional Renaissance specialists who had examined the work in situ during a supervised visit in November, and it was as unambiguous as scholarly authentication gets. A Raphael, period 1500 to 1504, Umbrian, pre-Florence. A work from the years when the young master was still under Perugino's influence, but already operating with a technical command that exceeded his teachers. The authentication was not made public immediately. Irene and Calvin and Nora and Patricia spent 3 months planning what happened next, a process that involved conversations with 4 major museums, 2 auction houses, a specialist in cultural restitution, and a representative of the Italian government's cultural ministry who had been informed through proper diplomatic channels that a work of this period and significance had surfaced in American private hands. The Italian government's position was measured. They expressed interest. They did not make demands. They sent a letter that was notably respectful in its tone, which Calvin told Nora was unusual enough to be significant. They want it, he said, but they know they can't force it, so they're being careful. The provenance chain for the Italian panel was, ultimately, among the cleaner ones in the collection. The work had been in a private collection in the Philippines in the 1930s, held by a family of Spanish colonial descent who had acquired it legitimately in the 19th century through a European art dealer. During the Japanese occupation, the family had evacuated and the collection had been seized. After the war, the family had not survived to reclaim it. No living heirs with documented connection to the specific work had emerged during Irene's extensive research, and the Italian government's own records showed no prior Italian claim to this particular panel. It had been taken from a family that no longer existed, by an occupation that no longer existed, and it had ended up in a concrete room in Kentucky. The chain of loss was real. The chain of recovery was also real. Both things were true simultaneously, the way Emmett had written about his own situation, resisting simple judgment. Nora made a decision about the Raphael that she had been moving toward for months, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small understandings that had built up like sediment in the time she spent with Emmett's files and his letters and his 26 years of correspondence with experts who never fully understood what they were helping him document. She announced it at a press conference in Lexington in March, the first time she had spoken publicly about any of it, standing at a podium in a room full of journalists who had been told only that a significant discovery in Kentucky would be disclosed. She read from a prepared statement, because some things you write down first so that you say them right. My grandfather Emmett Callahan built a room under his farm in 1951. He spent the next 28 years maintaining it and researching what it held and trying to determine the right thing to do with it. He did not fully resolve that question before he died. He left what he had to chance his word for it, which meant he left it to whoever in his family found it first. I found it. It took me 4 hours to drive there, 2 weeks to understand what the building permit meant, and 14 months to understand the full scope of what Emmett had built and what he'd saved, and what he'd been unable to answer. The collection includes works of significant historical and financial value. The complete assessment is documented and available. I'm not here today to discuss the numbers. I'm here to announce what's going to happen to the collection. The Raphael will be donated to the Opificio del Pietre d'Or in Florence, in partnership with the Smithsonian Institution, for permanent display and study. Not sold, not auctioned, given. Because Emmett spent 28 years asking what he owed the world for what he'd taken, and the answer I've come to is that a painting that beautiful belongs where people can see it. It belongs to the light, not to a vault. She paused. She had practiced this pause, because she wanted it to land. The remainder of the collection will be liquidated through a managed sale process, with proceeds directed as follows: 20% to a Provenance Research Fund, in perpetuity, for the ongoing work of tracing the origins of cultural objects displaced during the Pacific War. 20% to the University of Kentucky's Art History program, which educates students in Eastern Kentucky who deserve the same access to this field as students anywhere else. And 60% to the Callahan Family Foundation, which will fund educational access, early childhood programs, and economic opportunity in Harlan County, Kentucky. She looked up from the page. My grandfather was a farmer with a 7th grade education who spent the last 30 years of his life trying to do right by something he'd done in wartime that he couldn't fully justify and couldn't fully regret. He built the room to last because he believed someone would eventually find it who would know what to do. I'm not certain I know, but I know some things. I know that $300 million in a vault doesn't feed anyone. I know that a painting that's been in the dark for 70 years deserves to be seen. And I know that Harlan County, Kentucky, where my grandfather lived his entire life and where I spent my childhood, has been waiting a long time for something that came from it to come back to it. So that's what I'm doing. I'm bringing it back." She folded the page. The room was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of people who have been given something they weren't entirely prepared to receive. Then the questions started, and she answered them for 45 minutes, clearly and without performance, the way she answered everything, with the information she had, organized by what mattered. The check engine light turned out to be the oxygen sensor, which she had fixed in April for $212. It felt, she told Deb, like the most satisfying $212 she had ever spent, because it was the last time she spent money and felt the particular weight of money that might not be replaceable. She and Lily stayed in the apartment through June, because Lily was finishing first grade and routine mattered, and because Nora had spent 6 years building a structure and did not want to dismantle it carelessly just because the load-bearing wall had become, unexpectedly, load-bearing in a different direction. They moved in July, to a house in a neighborhood where the schools were better and the parking lot did not flood, and Lily chose her bedroom with the systematic consideration she brought to everything, walking the perimeter of each option and making notes in a small notebook she had started keeping because her mother kept one. The Callahan Family Foundation was established in August. Nora served as its founding director, a role that turned out to suit her exactly, because what it required was the ability to look at a complicated situation and understand what it actually contained rather than what it presented itself as, and the ability to make decisions that required patience and discipline and the refusal to let the math lie to you. The first cohort of foundation scholarships went to 16 Harlan County students in September, 12 of whom were the first in their families to attend college. Nora attended the orientation event for 3 of them who were going to UK's Lexington campus, because they were close enough to visit and because she wanted them to know that the money had a face and a history, that it had come from somewhere specific, from a man who had carried something heavy for 28 years and from a woman who had read a building permit twice and refused to let the math beat her. Mrs. Garrett, who had watched Lily for $20 a day and baked things with her and taught her card games, received an envelope in September containing a check for $20,000 and a note in Nora's handwriting. "For every day you showed up. With gratitude that I don't have adequate language for." Mrs. Garrett called to say she didn't need this. Nora said she knew that. Mrs. Garrett cried. Nora did not cry on the call, but she cried a little after, which felt correct. The Raphael left for Florence in October in a climate-controlled transport that took more planning than anything Nora had previously organized. Calvin Marsh supervised the crating personally. Dr. Adriana Voss was present for the transfer. The Italian Cultural Ministry sent a representative who shook Nora's hand with both of his and said something in Italian that was translated as, "Your grandfather was a man who understood that some things are bigger than the people who hold them." "Yes," Nora said. "He was." She stood in the pig pen after the transport left alone. Early morning, February cold, and looked at the hatch she had resealed after the last items were removed. The room below was empty now. The shelves were bare. The vaults were open and dark. The ventilation system had been disconnected, and the separate electrical circuit had been shut off for the first time since 1952. On the wall of the foundation office in Harlan County, Emmett's building permit, framed. His letter, framed beside it. And a photograph she had found in the filing cabinet Emmett at approximately 40, standing in this exact space when it was newly built, looking at the camera with the expression of someone who has done a thing they are not sure about and has decided to do it anyway. She stood at the locked gate for a long time. She thought about her father. She had not resolved what she thought about Gerald Callahan, and she had decided to leave the question open rather than answer it falsely, because Emmett had modeled for her what it looked like to live honestly with a question you couldn't fully resolve, and she had more respect for his model than for the alternative. She thought about Lily, who was 8 now, who had been told a version of all of this calibrated to her age and her particular mind, and who had responded by asking 3 questions in sequence. Did great-great-grandpa Emmett know the painting was a Raphael? Nora had said probably not for certain, but he suspected. Did the people it was taken from ever find out? Nora had said she didn't know, and that was one of the things the Providence Fund was for, to keep looking. Did you cry when you found it? And Nora had thought about the concrete room, and the clean air, and the hatch closing above her, and the drive back to Lexington, and the school bus at 3:30. And she had said, not when I found it. Later, when I understood what it meant. What did it mean? Lily had asked. She had thought about Emmett's phrase, leaving it to chance, and about the calculations that had brought it to her specifically. The reading of the building permit, the farming log, the lock combination assembled from dates in a family Bible her mother had kept. She had thought about the spreadsheet and the check engine light and the bakery alarm at 4:15, and about the specific kind of person those things make you if you survive them without becoming smaller than you started. It meant, she told Lily, that your great-great-grandfather believed in people who do the work, who read things carefully and don't give up when the math is bad and don't take the easy answer when the right answer is harder. A pause. He was looking for someone like that for a long time. And he found you, Lily said. He found us, Nora said. Lily considered this in her systematic way. Then she wrote something in her small notebook and closed it. Nora stood in the pig pen on a February morning, looking at the hatch that covered an empty room, and let that answer be the last word on the question of what she had found there and what it had meant and whether, in the end, the chance Emmett had put his faith in had been well placed. She thought it had. She thought he would have thought so too. The painting was in the light. 16 students were in college who had not been before. The Providence researchers were doing the work he had started. The foundation would outlast her the way the room had outlasted him, doing what it was built to do for longer than she would be there to see it. She locked the gate behind her. She walked back to the car. She started the engine, no warning lights, just the engine doing what engines do when they have been properly maintained, and she drove the 4 hours home to Lexington in the winter light, through the mountains that were still the mountains they had always been, unchanged by what had happened among the people living between them. Unchanged. And yet, a woman with a color-coded spreadsheet and a child who studied tornadoes had stood in a pig pen in February and read a building permit twice, had driven 4 hours and lifted a hatch, and read a letter and done the work, month after month, piece by piece, until the full picture came clear. The math had always been there. She had just been the one, finally, to work it all the way through. And in a gallery in Florence, in the light it had been kept from for 70 years, a painting looked out at the people who came to see it, ordinary people, students, families, strangers from places Emmett Callahan had never heard of, and it did what great things do when they are finally given back to the world. It was simply, completely, luminously there. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.